On behalf of the Center for the Study of Organized Hate, welcome, and thank you for joining us for this important discussion on building effective responses to the threat of hate speech and polarization to our community and democracies, held today in observance of the International Day for Countering Hate Speech. My name is Naila Mohammed. I lead the Center's program on Islamophobia and anti-migrant hate in North America. Before we begin the event, I want to let everyone know that this event is being recorded. Hate speech is not a new threat, but its scale, speed, and reach have been transformed by the digital age. Around the world, in North America, Europe, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, we are witnessing growing polarization, the normalization of dehumanizing rhetoric, incitement, and the spread of conspiracy theories and other harmful narratives that target people because of their religion, race, ethnicity, nationality, gender, or other aspects of their identity. These trends are not confined to any one country or region. They are now one of the biggest global challenges of our times. At the Center, we've published multiple reports on anti-Muslim and anti-migrant bigotry in North America, the UK, Europe, and South Asia, especially India, where we recorded 1,318 in-person hate speech events targeting Muslims and Christians in 2025 alone, a 97% increase from 2023. We've also documented and exposed how organized extremist networks, politicians, influencers, and other influential actors use digital platforms to amplify hate, spread conspiracy theories, and deepen societal divisions. We've seen how harmful narratives can move rapidly from the margins into mainstream political discourse, shaping public opinions, influencing policy, and inciting violence. Today, we want to focus on both the problem and its scale. Also, what works effectively to combat hate speech and its ever-expanding manifestation into violence. There are no simple answers. There is a growing body of evidence, however, experience from around the world that can help guide us. Today's panel brings together experts who have worked on these issues from different perspectives and in diverse contexts, from international institutions and government policy to human rights advocacy, research, and community engagement. We are honored to be joined by our panelists and grateful to them for sharing their experience with us today. With that, let's begin. I'll start with individual remarks by each of the speakers for about 5 minutes, followed by Q&A. Those in the audience, please keep sending your questions to us in the Q&A box throughout the event. We'll try to make time for as many questions as possible towards the end. Now, first, due to time constraints, I'd like to introduce Yena Yu, a political affairs officer at the United Nations Office on Genocide Prevention and the Responsibility to Protect. Her work focuses on early warning and risk assessment, as well as the responsibility to protect and countering and addressing hate speech. Yena, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First and foremost, thank you very much for this invitation to join today's events with other various distinguished panelists. And I would especially like to thank again to the organizer, the Center for the Study of Organized Hate, for inviting us. Today's discussion comes very timely, as you know, because today marks the 5th International Day for Countering Hate Speech. The first such day was marked in 2022, pursuant to UN General Assembly Resolution 75309 on promoting interreligious and intercultural dialogue and tolerance in countering hate speech. The resolution marks an important milestone in advancing global efforts to address and counter hate speech in all its forms and manifestations, including in digital context. Also responding to these global concerns at the United Nations, the Secretary General launched the UN Strategy and Plan of Action on Hate Speech in June 2019. The strategy's aim was to first enhance UN efforts to address root causes and drivers of hate speech, as well as to enable effective UN responses to the impact of hate speech on societies. According to the strategy, hate speech is defined as any kind of communication in speech, writing, or behavior that attacks or uses pejorative or discriminatory language with reference to a person or a group on the basis of who they are. And this identity component is a critical element to highlight, as it plays an important role in fragmenting and polarizing our societies, as well as violence and narratives of exclusion. And today, as mentioned, new technologies are contributing to its proliferation at an unprecedented speed and scope. And it's giving a sense of credibility and visibility to hateful narratives, amplifying them further, and at times leading to and contributing to the real life consequences. Hate speech notably plays a central role in accelerating processes that lead to a large-scale atrocity crime, including genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, as seen in history. So tackling hate speech is therefore an essential component of atrocity prevention, and it is for this reason that our office has been designated as the UN Global Focal Point on Hate Speech, coordinating efforts to implement the UN strategy and plan of action. The UN strategy is guided by 4 key principles, which I would like to outline here. First, the strategy is firmly rooted in human rights, especially the right to freedom of opinion and expression. The UN supports more speech, not less, as a key means to address hate speech. Second, tackling hate speech is the responsibility of all. Hate speech begins with all of us, and we have all a role to play in tackling it. And a whole of society approach is crucial to effectively tackle this phenomenon. Third, the UN supports a new generation of digital citizens empowered to recognize, reject, and stand up to hate speech. The Global Principles for Information Integrity, launched in June 2024, also provides a roadmap for a safer and more ethical digital ecosystem. Last but not least, fourth, we need to act effectively. So this calls for coordinated data collection and research, including on root causes, drivers, and conditions conducive to hate speech. So it is essential to continue to unpack and dissect the phenomenon, because by knowing it inside out, we're better able to address it. As I've just mentioned, addressing and countering hate speech is a multi-layered endeavor, which starts from tackling its root causes, preventing it from translating it into physical violence, towards dealing with its wider consequences on our societies. So to develop effective responses, collective coordinated efforts by all members of the international community remain essential. And the UN across the world has been working to support nationally grounded prevention, awareness raising, dialogue, and social cohesion efforts through partnerships with governments as well as other relevant stakeholders. These have included supporting education to build the resilience of learners to exclusionary rhetoric and hate speech, to raise awareness of their responsibilities offline and online, to supporting dialogue, prevention, mediation, and other initiatives to build mutual understanding and strengthen social cohesion, engaging and supporting victims of hate speech, as well as supporting the convening of diverse stakeholders to build coalitions and to make solutions attainable. While I will wrap up here in the interest of time, I look forward to discussing more in the course of the event. And just to note, today, right after this event, there's a high-level commemoration event of the International Day that's being held, which will touch upon the topic of the power of partnerships in tackling hate speech. And it will zoom in on practical tools and approaches and showcase various initiatives, good practices, and lessons learned across the world. So I'd encourage all of you to follow if available and interested. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Yana. We really appreciate your participation. We know you have to leave early as well, but any questions for Yana, please do drop them in the Q&A. Next, we'll go to Amira El-Gawabi, a journalist and human rights advocate who served as Canada's first ever special representative on combating Islamophobia between 2023 and 2026. Amira, welcome.
Thank you so much, Nyla. And of course, thank you to the Center for the Study of Organized Hate for this important convening on the International Day for Countering Hate Speech. And of course, thanks for all the leadership of the Center in terms of creating this opportunity for dialogue and to learn from the work that you have undertaken with so many important studies that help us try to wrap our arms around a very complicated and constantly moving issue. And so it's so valuable as well to be here with co-panelists. I'm looking forward to the conversation. I am joining you from Ottawa, which is on the unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. So, I will just sort of share a quick story. When I was working in civil society and advocacy, this is years and years ago when Facebook was just emerging as, the social media tool that it would eventually become in terms of communication, sharing events, being able to connect with people. I remember we were organizing an event to talk about, Muslim communities in Montreal, actually. And for the first time, I came across a post where direct death threats were being made to us as organizers of this event. And I was shocked and I reported it to police who didn't really know what to make of it because it was online, obviously was an anonymous user, and simply sort of brushed it aside. And I want to say that, of course, years later, what we've seen from the impact that social media can have on our society in terms of fueling hatred that can lead to murderous violence, I'm hoping that the attitudes have changed amongst our society, including amongst law enforcement. But the reality is that governments are really trying to keep up with these challenges, at least here in Canada. And I think that this is really important as we discuss how we counter hate speech, because it's all well and good to talk about it, to put our finger on it. But at the very end of the day, there has to be a way that we address the fact that these various platforms have not done enough to address the hate that is proliferating online. And several reports recently, even from the Center on the Study of Organized Hate, have shown that platforms are not doing enough. And so here in Canada, the extent of what this means and the consequences have been all too real. We've actually seen the highest number of killings of Muslims within a 5-year span of any G7 country. In 2017, in fact, we saw killings at a Quebec City mosque. The perpetrator, had seen Donald Trump put forward a so-called Muslim ban, if you remember, in his first time and term as president. And our prime minister at the time, Justin Trudeau, had tweeted out a message that was very much the opposite, that Canada is a place of welcome, a place of refuge. And that's what eventually set off the perpetrator, who walked into a mosque and tried to shoot as many people as he could, killing 6 men and injuring many others. 5 years later, another young man, similarly radicalized online with the hate speech related to Muslims, deliberately drove his truck into the Afzal family. They were out for an evening walk that evening. A mother, father, grandmother, and young daughter were killed instantly, and a young 9-year-old survived. So the perpetrators in those attacks were indeed radicalized online. Hate speech towards Muslims and other marginalized communities had impacted their worldviews, their own sense of safety, their own sense of conspiracies, of what they had to do to protect their own community, and that led them to take those violent acts of murder and terrorism. In the case of the Afzal family, the individual was convicted of terrorism motivated by white nationalism, the first of that kind in our country. And so, not so far from us here in Canada, of course, now just a few weeks ago, the tragic murders at the Islamic Center of San Diego also shook many of us to our core. As all of us know, sadly, 3 people were murdered: a security guard who died shielding others, Amin Abdullah, and 2 staff members, by teenagers who left behind the manifesto titled The New Crusade, Sons of Tarrant, and they had live streamed the attack. Now, they worship previous mass shooters as saints, and they were very young, 17 and 18 years old. So the question that we all have to ask is how did we get here? How do we get to the point where teenagers come to see the murder of others, Muslims at prayer, as a sacred act, or young children potentially? Thankfully, they were shielded. But these are the questions that come to the top of our mind. And what we know from researchers, like, for example, Canadian Amarnath Amarasangam, is that these young men didn't radicalize in this vacuum. They were indeed swimming in a vast online ecosystem of pseudoscience, incel ideology, and accelerationist propaganda, a quote, curriculum of hate, as he calls it, where each attacker's manifesto becomes instructional material for the next. And this is what is called, quote, saint culture. It turns mass murder into a lineage, a tradition, and something to carry forward. And so I have to say this as a Canadian, that this lineage is running through our country. The San Diego Manifesto's Heroes and Inspiration section listed the murderer in Quebec City and listed the murderer in London, Ontario, as inspiration, and of course listed the murderer in the Christchurch attack as well in 2019 that killed 51 Muslims, and whose name these teenagers took for their own manifesto title as well. And so the chain of inspiration that runs from these attacks, continue to remind us that violent Islamophobia, for example, here in Canada, has become a major source of inspiration for racist accelerationists looking to destabilize our communities and society at large. And so that's what the online space and online hate does, is that it completely dissolves the borders, and it means that the inspiration becomes transnational and dangerous right across our world. And of course, these grievances, and these grievance structures are not singular. The San Diego Manifesto targeted Muslims, but also Jews, LGBTQ plus people, women, and racialized immigrants. And this is consistent with what we've also heard by Amnesty International here in Canada, that recently documented in a recent report on intersectional hate that online spaces routinely weaponize one form of hatred to justify another. And for example, using women's rights rhetoric to amplify Islamophobia, or framing Muslim immigration as an existential threat to whiteness. So as we're going to explore today, none of us are immune to this. It is impacting our world. And certainly when we address hate speech, we have to come at it with global solutions.
Thank you, Amira. Next, Susan Benish founded and directs the Dangerous Speech Projects. Trained as an international human rights lawyer at Yale, Susan has worked as a refugee lawyer and advocate. She publishes widely and has taught and lectured at universities in many countries. She's an adjunct professor at American University and a faculty associate of the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. Susan, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm very grateful, first of all, for this kind invitation, and to join these magnificent panelists. I will just offer some some ideas based on the research that my colleagues and I have done at the Dangerous Speech Project, which is a small independent research team that has very proudly just joined forces with the Center for the Study of Organized Hate. So we are delighted to participate in a sense in both of those capacities. First of all, maybe I'll just take a moment to explain why we are called the Dangerous Speech Project. That's because dangerous speech is a category of rhetoric that I proposed the name and began to describe it about a decade ago after observing I don't recommend this, but I looked at the statements made by, let's just call them malevolent civilian political leaders in many countries and cultures and even historical periods. I looked at those in the course of some other research I was doing and was absolutely stunned at how similar that rhetoric is from case to case. That led to an insight that perhaps this sort of rhetoric is an important precursor to intergroup violence, to various forms of atrocities, including genocide, because after all, no human, no baby has ever been born already hating or even fearing um, members of another human group of any kind. In the words of a song from the musical South Pacific, you have to be carefully taught. So it turns out that there is a special category that we now call dangerous speech that overlaps with hate speech, but is not quite the same. There's some dangerous speech that isn't hateful. It's much more based on fear, which is the operative emotion. Fear, after all, is a very powerful driver of biological responses in the human body. Unlike hatred, fear is also much easier to define than hatred. So we have been working on that idea now for many years. We also have done a lot of work on finding the best ways to effectively undermine hate speech and dangerous speech. And now I'd like to quickly offer some ideas drawing from our research findings and also from our experience of trying to find these most effective interventions to undermine hate speech and dangerous speech. Uh, First of all, it is absolutely vital to broaden the stakeholders, to broaden the kinds of people who participate in finding such efforts, the best methods, and then also in deploying them. The stakeholders should be broadened in a variety of ways, of which, in the interest of time, I'll just mention two. First of all, maybe 90 or 95% of discussions regarding hate speech and what to do about it in a variety of sectors, in academia, in policy circles, and even curiously among activists. Some huge proportion, I'm just going to guess at 95%, have focused on only a very small and specific category of actors who might make things better, namely the CEOs of the mostly American tech companies, like Facebook has already been mentioned, now it's Meta. And of course, a small list of other companies that have such vast power over now human communication, how it circulates and what sort of damage it does. Those CEOs, however, have made it increasingly clear in the last few years that they're not interested in doing very much to solve this set of problems. It's not only one problem, it is a variety. Just for one example, Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Meta, the company that owns Facebook and a number of other platforms, gave a big talk in January of 2025 already, announcing that he was pulling back very significantly on content moderation to explicitly allow much more hate speech to circulate on Meta's platforms, and also firing a large number of fact checkers who were part of a significant ecosystem of fact checkers that Meta had built. He dispensed with that. He's not the only one. Obviously, Elon Musk is a stunning example of someone who's made it extremely clear that although he could, since he controls X, could act very significantly against hate speech, his wish is absolutely not to do that. So we began to think about what other sorts of actors might be useful in this work. The second kind of actor that often gets referred to is governments. However, and governments have in some cases tried to respond productively, but mostly what the governments do, frankly, is to attempt to get the CEOs of tech companies to deal more effectively with the problem. And that is of only limited effectiveness. So who else? Who else could do something? And the answer we have put a lot of effort into understanding now is everybody else, frankly, civil society, the billions of those of us who are online. This is important since we reflect that offline human behavior, including speech, is governed much more by social norms, by perceptions of what other people think it is acceptable to say and do, than even by law. You wear a seatbelt, most likely, not because there's a law against it, but because there's a social norm against it. And of course, that's a trivial example, but it's a significant one since behavior regarding seatbelts has changed a lot in the last few decades. Other norms of human behavior and speech have also changed rapidly. One important lesson about norms is that they can change very quickly in both directions, for ill and also for good. So we insist that it is very important to include bottom-up efforts, and in particular, members of societies affected by hate speech, dangerous speech, in the development and also the application of tools to undermine hate speech and dangerous speech, and also to reverse polarization. In a variety of senses. This leads me to the second way in which it's, in our view, tremendously important to broaden stakeholders, and that is with respect to who is involved on a global scale. Historically and including right now, the vast majority of the development of tools, including AI tools for undermining hate speech, dangerous speech, and polarization, are built in the United States or Europe, built in English. For example, LLMs are built in English, and then when they are to be applied in other languages, they get translated, which misses a tremendous amount of important social and cultural context. So it's absolutely vital when there is brainstorming and building of new tools for people who know the relevant context and languages to be directly involved. They should also be asked what it is that they want and need to respond to hate speech and polarization. Too often engineers and designers get excited about the possibility of building some kind of tool. You know, I can build it, therefore I do. And then they sort of offer it up to the world without ever having consulted with the people who they imagine might use such a tool. And then I'd like to conclude by just mentioning that at the Dangerous Speech Project, we have spent the last 7 or 8 years going and looking for people who are already doing this, people who are already responding to hate speech, dangerous speech, and polarization, mostly but not entirely online. And we were happily surprised to find that there are tens of thousands of people who do this regularly. Many of them have made it kind of their part-time thing. Some of them do it as individuals. As a general rule, the individuals are usually, but not always, responding to attacks on them. So they are often members of marginalized groups and have been attacked as members of marginalized groups. Of course, then they are taking on an exhausting and often psychologically draining and frightening task in responding to hateful attacks and often violent threats. Then there are also, we found an even much larger number of people who work together in groups of what we call counter speakers. responding to mainly to hate speech online. And interestingly, among those we have found, those are usually not members of the groups being targeted by the hate speech. Those are very often allies, other members of the same societies who are appalled by the attacks. Those people are conducting a large number and variety of natural experiments on how to do this. So I will close with an exhortation, with a plea that there be much more study of those efforts and what sort of effects they have in the world. They are so far largely human efforts. They can be combined with AI to amplify them greatly. In our view, and from the findings of surveys conducted by my colleague Kathy Berger, our director of research, with some other colleagues, those experienced counter speakers are not interested in having their voices supplanted or replaced by synthetic counter speech, by AI bots. They want help from the bots, but they want to continue to speak themselves, in part because you might find this surprising. They do not find responding to hatred dispiriting or exhausting. In many cases, they are bolstered and they have a sense of self-efficacy from engaging in this work, particularly with other people. I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Susan. I appreciate it. I understand that Yenna has to jump off. Thank you so much for being a part of this panel discussion, Yenna. I really appreciate it. We will take whatever questions that come towards you and I'll note them and send them over to you. Hopefully, we can find a way to respond back to the audience. Thank you
Thank you
again.
so much. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us. Last but not least, my colleague, Gustika Yusuf Hatta, a researcher at the Center for the Study of Organized Hate, focusing on digital extremism and online harms across Southeast Asia. Before joining the center, Gustika built expertise across policy and civil society institutions. Gustika, welcome and thank you for joining us. We know it's a little late in Jakarta, but we appreciate it.
Thank you, Nyla, for the introduction. Good morning, good evening, or good afternoon, wherever you may be joining from. Well, I think I'd just start on Southeast Asia. So on my research, Southeast Asia cannot talk about hate speech without also talking about identity, which is religion, ethnicity, gender, nationality, and who gets to belong. I think we all know that Southeast Asia is very, very diverse. So it's very difficult to pin down on what is exactly the issue, the one particular issue in Southeast Asia. But I think we can actually see a pattern. I mean, to start, I'd like to mention CSOH's ongoing research on Southeast Asia on discourse surrounding the Rohingya community on social media, which can be perceived as the most documented case in the region. They do, as refugees, receive a lot of hate from the populations of the receiving country, and that kind of built up. So it didn't happen overnight. And we know, thanks largely to the UN's independent investigative mechanism for Myanmar, that the 2017 violence against the Rohingya minority was not just accompanied by hate speech, but it was actually organized through it. Investigators had identified a cover military-run network on Facebook that pushed out thousands of posts dehumanizing the Rohingya, in which one single post alone drew over 200 comments calling for Rohingya people to be shot, killed, or permanently removed from Myanmar. And that is the reason why they are the largest refugee community in Southeast Asia. And years later, Rohingya communities inside Myanmar, in the camps of Bangladesh, and in the refuge in other parts of Southeast Asia, such as Malaysia and Indonesia, are still fighting a steady stream of dehumanizing disinformation online, as widely documented by refugee rights groups. While Rohingya case may be the most conspicuous example in Southeast Asia, it is far from the only one. In Indonesia, for example, where I'm from, the Human Rights Watch has documented how biased statements and censorship directives from the state institutions have lent legitimacy to hostility, at times signaling that discrimination against something that is deviant or deviance is socially acceptable. In Indonesian language, they may call it penyimpangan. But hate speech in Southeast Asia does not only emerge from longstanding ethnic or religious fault lines, nor does it always originate from the state. It actually flourishes through everyday nationalism and can escalate remarkably quickly, even between neighboring countries that share deep cultural ties. I mean, if I could reflect back to when I was in high school, watching soccer or football, it was a huge discourse whenever on Twitter, now it's called X, whenever there's a competition between Malaysia and Indonesia, and they fight about culture and they call each other racial slurs, and it's somewhat normalized. And it's, to me, like 15 years later or so, it's a bit, you kind of reflect back and think it's how disgusting that was, with the language that was used, and it's just not supposed to be acceptable. And speaking of interstate conflict as well, more recently in 2015, the Cambodia-Thailand border conflict also demonstrated how quickly these dynamics can intensify during a geopolitical crisis. So what began as a territorial and military dispute almost immediately spread to Facebook, X, and YouTube. So nationalist rhetoric on both sides curdled into xenophobic memes and dehumanizing narratives about the other. So a phenomenon documented by journalists and human rights organizations in both countries. Migrant workers, ordinary civilians, and even human rights offenders who simply called for restraint became targets of threats and harassment, which kind of reminds me back again, when Twitter just started, and I guess this sort of intensified. That's a reflection, a personal reflection, I guess, being a social media native, so to speak, as a millennial. So by December, when the two governments renewed their ceasefire, so Cambodia and Thailand, the agreement explicitly committed both sides to preventing the spread of false information online. So by default, it's a tacit admission that the digital information war that resulted from this physical war became almost as dangerous as the conflict at the border itself. So there's also actually a problem of conflation between hate speech and free speech. And this is something that I would also like to focus on today, because we tend to picture hate speech as something recognizable: slurs, explicit calls for violence, something that you can basically pinpoint immediately. But I guess building up on what Susan mentioned earlier as well, across Southeast Asia, the most damaging speech rarely looks obvious. Sometimes they look like opinions or guised as moral concern, which is then claimed to be free speech. I mean, being on social media, I also often, encounter those sort of comments. And it's, I guess, the perception that the public has as well. And touching on what I mentioned earlier about deviation or deviance, a phrase that I also constantly see on social media is that it's okay to bully or cyberbully, because those who are deviant, like the LGBTQ community, their practices or lifestyle is shunned by all religions, so we have to put them in their place. So it's much like relabeling, like you're relabeling hate speech as free speech, or as relabeling the target as a problem, and relabeling bullying as correction or cyberbullying as correction. And at times it's perceived as some sort of service to the community, which is quite crazy to me. And the same logic also applies to religious minorities. Even I think For those who don't know, Indonesia is a Muslim majority country. It's not an Islamic country, but it's the most populous country with Muslims in it, if that makes sense. Yeah, it's a Muslim majority country. And so when we talk about the widely accepted denomination in Indonesia is Sunni. So they religious minorities such as the Ahmadiyya or Shia Muslims receive a lot of discrimination as well. So in a lot of these people's opinions, like they are considered to be not really Muslim because they are not following the Shia rule, the Sunni rule. So it becomes a whole mess because they are denying them the right to define their own identity, the right to practice their beliefs. Apparently, it's not correct about like how they pray is not correct, and thus it legitimizes their exclusion from public life. On several occasions, they are also not allowed to create their build their mosques, and you do encounter social media comments that say their blood is halal, which is permitted, and it's very sad that those sort of comments are not uncommon. Like it's basically putting them as an enemy. So there's that as well on the correction part. So researchers studying the Indonesian social media discourse have documented exactly this pattern as a recurring structure. So faithful versus deviant, patriot versus traitor, and the real majority versus supposed coddled minority. So even though they're a minority, they get favors and this and that. So it's a whole thing. So these may not seem as overtly hate speech in the beginning, but because they're repackaged as collective values. So even though hate speech is right in front of our eyes, if we're not really exposed to diversity, it might just go over our heads. So I guess when we talk about building effective responses in Southeast Asia, I would personally argue that our hardest problem is not catching the obvious hate speech, but recognizing the much larger socially sanctioned space where exclusion gets relabeled as opinion, discipline, or for expression, as I previously mentioned. So as the space where dehumanization gets rehearsed, normalized, and eventually scaled. And that's what we always see in Southeast Asia. But I don't want to be very pessimistic about like what I've said earlier. The region also offers reason for optimism. Some of the most effective responses have come not from censorship alone, because that's not the most effective thing to do, because people will find ways to do things that are illegal always or not correct. But we see Indonesia is a very communal, Southeast Asia generally is a very communal region. So we see from communities deliberately building alternative narratives is very helpful. For example, again, in Indonesia, because I mostly work in Indonesia, I'm Indonesian, I do observe the Gus Durian network. So this network was named after Indonesia's fourth president, Abdurrahman Wahid, and his nickname is Gus Dur. He was widely known for championing religious pluralism, racial tolerance, and has spent more than a decade promoting interfaith solidarity. And we have also seen this emerge in the Philippines. Initiatives such as Facts First Philippines, PH, have brought together universities, journalists, fact checkers, and civil society organizations to collectively respond to online disinformation and manipulative narratives, particularly in the context of elections. So taken together, these examples suggest that Southeast Asia cannot moderate its way out of hate speech, but effective responses require trusted communities, broad coalitions, and opportunities for people to encounter those who are different from themselves before polarization actually takes hold. So ultimately, the question is not simply how we remove harmful speech, but how we build societies that are more resilient to it in the first place. And thank you. I think I might have gone over time. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Gustika. I have a few questions to start off with, and then we do have some questions in the chat box, the Q&A box. Amira, I'll pose my first question to you. It's twofold. So first, how do communities respond when the hate speech itself comes from elected leaders, the very people who are supposed to protect them? And the second part of my question is, what policies or initiatives can governments and leaders pursue to move beyond condemning hate speech towards measurably reducing its harm and strengthening communities' sense of safety and belonging?
So these are really important questions, building on what the co-panelists have been talking about, thinking about all the different strategies that we have at our disposal to counter what has been, I want to say sort of an open season for hate speech. Here in Canada, I will say, though, that elected leaders promoting hate, uh, thankfully and mercifully, have not sort of taken root. And I would say, particularly as we've seen the deadly consequences that really shifted the political landscape, in particular after the attack in London, Ontario in 2021, we found that all federal political parties finally acknowledged Islamophobia as a real and lethal threat. And this is really critical because it's important to say Islamophobia remains globally a form of hatred and discrimination that is almost acceptable in the sense that things that are said and trafficked about Muslims would never be acceptable about any other minority group. And yet, as we heard, for example, from Gustika outline, couched in various rhetoric, couched in, potential critique, efforts to sort of get these types of divisive narratives into the public consciousness continue. And so that type of dog whistling, the coded rhetoric, the stereotype, the racial profiling, the othering, all of that is used to create that us versus them. And then you've got hostile media narratives, certainly as we've seen now with the increase of AI narratives, also sort of drowning out sort of legitimate narratives and discussion online. You're seeing that various communities continue to be portrayed as problems, as in need of, for example, we saw a lot of deportation kind of rhetoric, out of the US through one of the studies that the center put out, attacking mosques, types of rhetoric that, again, you would easily see condemnation from those in authority about, but because it relates to Muslims, you see that either silence from people who should be speaking out and really rallying people to unite against such narratives, or even further leaning into these narratives at a global level. And so the other point that has to be made here is that the relationship between hate speech, between dehumanization, between othering can have these very critical spillover effects into civil liberties, into our democracies, and what human rights can be exchanged then to sort of appease politics and politicians who are trying to use this type of scapegoating of different communities to win political points. And this is where, of course, things can get very, very risky and very, very dangerous. And so these types of hateful narratives that can really essentially proliferate, as we've been hearing, around the world and are not respecting borders means that the responses from our federal officials and policymakers has to be really robust. Here in Canada, for instance, we saw in 2020 a report that looked and found 6,600 online channels, pages, and groups across Facebook, Twitter, 4chan, where Canadians were actively engaged in right-wing extremism and spreading hateful narratives to millions of people worldwide. And most recently, a parliamentary committee heard about how, again, to Susan's point, the platforms are really failing to act on this hate that is being proliferating. So what can we do about it? Well, here in Canada, we just had the introduction of a new legislation called the Safe Social Media Act, Bill C-34, that sort of addresses overall harms in these online spaces with a potential duty to act responsibly on the social media platforms. It remains to be seen whether or not that's going to do the trick. We also see the proposal to create a super body, essentially, a digital regulator that would be holding these platforms accountable. Is that the solution here? It, again, remains to be seen, but clearly governments know that there are all sorts of harmful content, including the hate speech that we're talking about today, which includes hate speech that incites violence. And so this is going to be very important. But as the policymakers around the world are hopefully grappling at where there is that political will to do so, the importance of really fostering media literacy, education within our communities remains critical. So, for instance, my former office published a guide that's still available online called the Canadian Guide for Understanding and Combating Islamophobia, addresses much of the stereotypes and the dangerous narratives about Muslim communities with reality checks. This is very important to create a resilient populations. The guide has been used in schools, in workplaces, by law enforcement, in order to, again, really create that resilience that we need in our populations to stand against all forms of hatred, and particularly those forms where, again, as we've heard, there are efforts to sort of enter into the public space, with quote unquote legitimate discussion about minority communities, but really do have nefarious means. So twofold approach. Policymakers have a responsibility to hold these platforms accountable, to do more to ensure that, citizens are protected from, what we're seeing. And then on the second hand, really that strong education that we continuously need to ensure that people are able to recognize, what they're seeing as being hate. But of course, this becomes more and more challenging. One of the most significant threats to Canadians, as recognized in a report recently published by our government, was the fact that less and less people will be able to distinguish between what is true and what is not true online. That is a great concern to not just Canadians, but to all of us worldwide. And so, again, these are the types of challenges that unfortunately governments have been either slow to respond to or, in fact, just allowing to get worse. So there is a huge responsibility for all of us to do more to push for action.
Thank you so much, Amira. Well, for the sake of time, we have about 6 minutes left. I'll ask for quick responses to this. Susan, the Dangerous Speech Project has long argued that not all harmful speech carries the same risk leading to violence. What can civil society organizations and tech platforms do to better identify and respond to dangerous speech? And I believe we also have a question that's similar in the audience asking, what proactive and preventative measures can all of us take to stop hate speech and polarization to occur in the first place?
So since time is tight, I'll answer quickly. I can't stop myself from saying that it would be very useful for more tech platforms and also more people who are concerned to learn what we call the Dangerous Speech Framework. It's on our website, www.dangerousspeech.org. It identifies very specifically and clearly some hallmarks in response to the very wise question. I'd quickly offer a couple of things. One is consider responding. And I say consider because, there's that old maxim, don't feed the trolls, which incorporates the idea that, first of all, trolls like it when you respond. It makes them feel important. And secondly, it can put the person who responds at risk. So, at risk at least of a vitriolic clapback from a troll. One other very important finding, though, of our studies of counterspeakers is that they say that they are not attempting to change the mind or even the discourse of the people to whom they respond. Their target is the much larger number of people who are watching and listening to most online exchanges, the audience, the people we call the movable middle. So I would suggest that you consider emerging from the audience and beginning to take cautious part in counterspeaking. And secondly, that you help other people to understand the difference between discourse that may be offensive or contentious, and content or discourse that is dangerous. What we mean by dangerous is that it has a capacity to make violence more likely. Groups, communities online can do what communities offline have long done, which is to set their own discourse norms. We all know unspoken rules about what it is and is not acceptable to say. We need to bring those long-standing human practices from offline society online, and also practice them more vigorously offline as well.
Thank you, Susan. There are a few questions for you in the Q&A box. Please feel free to answer them directly. Gustika, hate speech has been persistent in Southeast Asia, as you mentioned. What strategies have civil society and grassroots organizations there deployed that are actually working, if any?
Yeah, so I guess I'll just elaborate on the Gus Durian Network, for example, but they're not the only organization that works on this. Previously, when I was still at an Indonesian local NGO before, so I guess that was 6 years, 6 years ago. We also did interventions in areas that are perceived to be the most extreme. There's like basically there's a research on that, and then you do interventions. And again, we start with the communities. So often certain communities haven't met, they've only heard of other people, but they've never met those people. So I guess, living in a country that is supposedly very diverse, we have 17,508 islands in Indonesia, but there might be a chance that you would just stay where you are and you wouldn't meet that other person. So community is very important. The successes of counter speech is very much from the bottom, and it's not from top down institutions. But also with networks like the Gus Durian Network, if I may elaborate on that, is they are Gus Dur was a person who was part of like an Islamic organization, and Indonesia being a Muslim majority country. So they promote what is actually, tolerance that is actually taught in the Islamic religion to the Muslims, because, but also to other people for them to understand what it's about. So that's one example on how communities try to basically learn together on and work on what we know, and basically emphasize the peace aspect of it. And basically we sort of look as well into the context that hate speech is not simply a moderation problem, but it's an information ecosystem problem that requires broad coalitions rather than isolated interventions. So again, maybe it's very cliche, but community is again very much important in this. And yeah.
Thank you, Gustika. Well, this event has come to an end. I'd like to thank all of the panelists. We appreciate your time and participation. Also, if you haven't already signed up yet, please visit our website and join our main mailing list, where we share updates about our ongoing work and projects. Please stay connected, stay engaged, and stay safe. Thank you for joining.